Thank you all. Thank you all for being here. We're so glad you've joined us on this Tuesday morning or afternoon or whatever time zone you're in. Today, we are so excited to be welcoming our friends again, Cassandra, Jason, and Abby from the Center for Ethical Land Transition. And this is also our last offering of the year. And this has been a really eventful year for us, really kind of launching into this work of land justice. And we're just really grateful for the support of the community that we have been building together in doing this work and doing it together. And so this is also a celebratory moment, just completing this year and being present to the work ahead and the call that we feel in our bones and being in service of land justice. And we're so grateful for our ongoing collaboration with CELT and the ways in which we are developing and doing this work together. And this training has certainly been a fruit of that. And so thank you all for being here. And with that, I will pass it over to our friends who will be hosting our training today. Thank you, Cassandra and Jason and Abby.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Welcome, everyone. Notice a few people are still coming in right now, but I think it's time to dig in. So, yeah, very, very grateful to be here again. And, right now I am going to jump in to our first slides just to make sure people have all of their things with them. And let me go to share screen. There it is. All right, so as we start today, do you want to just put in an extra little reminder to see if people were able to print the genuine offers and ethical land transitions rubric, and also the threshold moments document. If you weren't able to print these documents, it's not a huge deal. They are available. They will be available. You'll be able to look at them. We're going to review them a bit in our training today. So it's all right if you don't have them. If you do have them, it's just an extra little piece of support because you can be working with them in front of you. Also want to make sure that you do have a pen and pencil and paper to take some notes. With that said, a big reminder for everyone who has joined us before or who is new in this part 3, these presentations and the recordings of them and the slides are all available at a later time. And so you don't have to write anything down. You can just write down what you feel inspired in response to the training itself. So don't worry if you're not taking comprehensive notes, but it is great to write things down that are the things that you find resonate with you the most and you want to take note of. And of course, I hope you have anything else that you need right now to be present with us, such as something to drink and ways to be comfortable. So, today, predominantly Cassandra and I are jumping into facilitating, and we're really excited for what we have to present. And yeah, I get to anchor us today with some intentions and prayer. So I'm gonna come out of my screen sharing so that I can be a little more personal with that. Oh, there it is. So wherever you're at, I just want to invite everyone to take a really big deep breath and to find yourself where you're sitting. We got a couple of hours we're going to spend together today, and we have a lot of really beautiful and challenging things to talk about. Also some very thrilling things, some really useful tools. And as we go into that, I want to start us off with a prayer today on loving accountability. So I invite you to be wherever you're at, in your home, sitting or standing, finding yourself a little bit more rooted in your chair, on the floor, and I invite you to be present with your eyes open or closed as you see fit. Great Spirit. I feel the gratitude swelling in myself to get to spend today in this container with these beautiful humans, brought together with the intentions of love, with the intentions of justice, the intentions of expanding each of our capacities to make meaningful impact in the world. And I pray that we are held today and beyond today in loving accountability. There's something so incredible about edges of growth, of edges that are uncomfortable. And we get to practice being on growth edges that can be uncomfortable, but also can be very thrilling and can bring out very special abilities that maybe we didn't know we had before. I pray that we can deepen into trust that we are on this journey together, and that when we get to be witnessed in a state of tenderness or a state of making mistakes, I trust that we can use those moments as opportunities to deepen into connection with each other. That there is truly no great mistake that is made. The mistake is not being able to harness the opportunity when someone is hurt or when we hurt somebody else, because those are incredible opportunities to deepen into loving accountability. And I pray that as we sit in these really complicated landscapes, we will be able to hold each other in beautiful ways, and that we'll be able to learn new vocabularies and new skills in doing that. And I pray that we can all deepen into the trust that we are not alone in any of this work, that love and compassion wraps around all of us, and that we get to step forward together in this world that we're trying to create, where we're making an incredible loving impact on us, on our communities, and on other communities that we're working to support. Thank you, and amen. I notice I've given myself the role of both saying a prayer and then immediately jumping back into slides, which is a very challenging thing. So I'm taking a moment. Thank you, everyone. All right, now you get to witness me in real time interchange and go right back into our training overview because we got stuff to accomplish. So just a little recap from last time that this.
Jason, you got muted by accident. Could you?
That's okay, that's okay. I'm here. Thank you, Brenna. All right, we're jumping back in. Just to do a brief recap, this is part 3 of our training. And you've seen these words before, that this training space is for inquiry of our beliefs and assumptions, examining the impact of colonialism on human relationships, practical tools for working with Black and Indigenous folks, all for the sake of dismantling white supremacy in our lifetimes, making meaningful offers of land justice, and preserving Black and Indigenous life. And in addition to that, for part 3 today, we're focusing on one very prominent case study to really examine some missteps that we have witnessed in the work of land justice, some very specific threshold moments in this process, both for this case study and for each of you potentially in your land transitions. and then some more specific tools for how title holders can prepare for land transitions and some practical tools and resources. So there is quite a bit of content today, and I really want to encourage everyone again to remember that you will be able to review all of these things, including this recording, at any time after this. So if you feel like there's something that you missed, there's always a chance to go back to it. And with that said, I only get to talk for a couple more slides, and then I'm going to hand it off. To begin us off, we have this list of common players of entities in land transition processes. Of these common players, title holders are, of course, an important one. BIPOC groups who are seeking land reunion is another very important one. The land itself, when we say the land itself, that's typically the facility, what type of dwellings are on that land, what type of resources are on that land, etc. Another entity are land transition facilitators. Part of what CELT does is offer different types of facilitation for land transitions. And there are more organizations who are emerging right now doing this work. And finally, there's this additional entity that is not just the land itself, but it's a future beyond our time that we are all stewarding towards. That's kind of the most esoteric and also one of the pieces that I enjoy talking about the most. With that said, today we're focusing on title holders, because title holders are kind of some of the primary clients that CELT has worked with. And at this moment for this training, it's a primary audience that we're trying to offer specific tools for. And with that said, I'm going to hand off to Cassandra, who's going to bring us through our first part, our case study.
Hello, everyone. It's good to be back in Zoom town with you, where we congregate so uniquely. Thank you so much, Jason, and all of the opening, both toggling from prayer to slides that you've done so well. I want to just note on those past two slides, you didn't see the words buyers, sellers, or real estate agents. And we are working to reframe. That's one of the things that the Center for Ethical Land Transition does, is reframe, build new literacies, give new languages to the land transition process so that we can hold it in a more ethical context that regards the land as sacred, and also this future that we're co-stewarding as something that's compelling to all of us. So, and in this situation, many of you have heard, if you've come to presentations before, about the Shelterwood story. Well, we were, in the desire to go deeper and to really give y'all some good context, we decided to take the Shelterwood story and just break it down and go all the way into the details, allowing us to examine threshold moments that occurred in this process. And this isn't, I really want to say that we've taken the name of the church out of this. We're calling it a Christian church organization. We've taken their name out of it because this is really not about indicting. Okay, thanks. Yeah. This is not about pointing fingers and making it about what they did wrong. It's really about learning, because they didn't have a nuns and nuns. They didn't have a land justice futures course. They didn't have the kind of support. So I really want to hold that we're learning from the mistakes that were made in this process, so that we can have a different experience. And so this case study we're just going to call it the CCO, the Christian Church Organization in Shelterwood. I was representing as an agent and accomplice in a Black, Indigenous, queer, BIPOC reunion land project. I worked with Shelterwood, and that meant that I worked with the CCO and got a chance to come to understand these threshold moments. So we're going to just, I identified these two players, the Shelterwood and CCO, and we're going to go through and we're going to really just break down these threshold moments.
we've identified 9 threshold moments. And so you're going to see these listed on the left-hand side of the slide. And these are certainly in a sequence of events that generally happen in this sequence, and sometimes can, happen a little bit out of sequence as well. We're going to start with internal assessment of values. So at some point before putting this land on the market, CCO decided to sell it. And somewhere in this similar time frame, they actually passed resolutions about racial healing within their church. And they have the intention to move beyond performative anti-racism. They say this, into the world, and understand that it requires introspection and internal transformation, both individually and institutionally. I think, unfortunately, they just didn't know how to put that into action quite yet. So they did do some internal assessment of values, but they decided to sell the property in a conventional way. So that was a threshold moment. They could have done, if they would have had more support, maybe they would have done it differently. If they would have seen other options, maybe they would have done it differently, but they didn't. So they went on the market. They own multiple properties, and they listed it for $3.5 million with a conventional real estate broker. And there was actually a bidding war. And so let's go to the next threshold moment. So they chose a real estate agent on the market, and they also had 2 people from within this huge congregation that had to be the decision makers about to go through that real estate process. Unfortunately, those folks weren't trained and supported in how to embody the values of racial healing. And they also didn't know that much about the land itself. They were administrators within this large church organization, and they were tasked with making executive decisions about something that they actually didn't really know very much about. And so the next threshold moment would be gathering information about the facility and about the land stewardship. But unfortunately, these folks didn't have any detailed knowledge about the property for sale, and didn't, I think, even know how to gather what they needed to know. So there were caretakers of this camp, of course, people who knew all about everything, because that's how it stayed running for so many years, but they weren't involved in the decision-making process. Nor the disclosure. In real estate, we call it the disclosure process. They weren't involved in the disclosure process. So while Shelterwood was doing our inspections, we actually unexpectedly met one of the primary caretakers who started to share information about the forest, about the water system, about where the files were stored that had years and years of documented information about this. And so, unfortunately, though, this didn't fit within the real estate process as sort of determined by these 2 folks who were making the decisions and the listing broker, the listing agent. And so we weren't allowed to talk to him anymore because he was disclosing material facts that were so important that we needed to know, but he was not contained, he was like a wild card. He wasn't contained by the 2 executives and the listing agent. And so it was fascinating because this person actually had the information that we needed the most. So obviously there's very different ways to go about this, which we'll be going over later in this training. So in the next threshold moment, in a real estate process, there's inspections and appraisals that need to be done. And title holders can participate in that, absolutely. But unfortunately, the CCO was not available for participating financially in that. And so that meant that Shelterwood invested at their own risk over $30,000 to do their due diligence and conduct multiple inspections on this 900-acre camp. And again, that doesn't have to go that way. But this is how it can go in a real estate process. In the next threshold, we're talking about the seller doing due diligence and support, or responding to the due diligence and taking care of the buyers. So of course, this was a big camp that had been lots of deferred maintenance, lots of things that hadn't been taken care of over the years. And the inspections revealed not only like poor conditions, but some dangerous conditions. Mold in the commercial kitchen, propane leaks throughout the camp, caved in and broken septic systems, issues with the swimming pool, like massive issues. But unfortunately, the CCO and those executives weren't actually capable of participating in repairs, and were only able to credit $58,000. I'm this part of the story may have come up in I'm sorry, I'm getting out of sequence, but I will say that we were in contract for $4 million. And so that they were only willing to credit $58,000 for these very intense issues was really left the Shelterwood feeling not met by them in the process. The transparent disclosures. So here in a real estate process, the sellers or title holders are actually like bound by law to disclose as much as they can. And unfortunately, it was discovered in escrow. We were in contract that they had misrepresented the condition of the forest. They had said that it was not logged for decades, when in fact it had actually recently been logged. And we only found that out because of by chance of meeting the caretaker and the person who actually knew and could guide us to the records of the logging history of this place. So in the next threshold, sort of the story of what happened, like who's telling the story. Oh, here it is. It was listed at 3.5. We were in it was competitive, and we were luckily Shelterwood was very well funded, so we were able to get the winning bid. But according to the CCO, in their narrative, because they chose a Black and Indigenous group, that they were participating in land justice, and that it could be an example of racial healing. Unfortunately, we didn't experience that in the relationships with them. And in fact, after we'll speak to that in one of the other thresholds, but this is Shelterwood's narrative, that the church organization didn't hardly know anything about the facility and didn't meaningfully understand the land that they were selling, nor openly share information or introduce them to the caretakers who would have helped them learn. And because of that, there was a deception about the condition of the land. They didn't support the cost of the inspections or meaningfully respond to those with price credits or help in repairing the damages to the facility. Shelterwood's perspective is that they sold to Shelterwood because they were the highest bidder. And they did get the most, that we were the highest bidder. And unfortunately, we had the experience during the escrow that when we asked for something, they insinuated that they would, if we pushed to ask for much of anything, that they would pull out. So they made it feel very tenuous. Plus, we only had 3 weeks for the process of inspecting. So it was a very intense process that left Shelterwood feeling like these folks didn't actually care about the land or racial healing, but that they wanted to move it fast, give very little credits, and get the most money. And for those of you who might recognize Lael, who was there, one of the primary folks going through this process. In Lael's perspective, the CCO got the best of both worlds because they got the most money and they had BIPOC buyers. So another thing that people are interested in often is the establishment of a future relationship. But as you can imagine, after going through all of this, it was not very interesting for Shelterwood to have an ongoing relationship with these folks who did not acknowledge the harm that they had caused in the land transition process. They did ask, CCO did want future access to the camp. They also even asked Shelterwood to speak at a public event for their congregation, but Shelterwood was not allowed to talk about the price of the sale. And because of that, Shelterwood decided that they wouldn't participate in that because they didn't feel that they wanted to get up in front of a bunch of people and kind of be the poster child for something that they didn't realize, that they didn't feel was actually accurate to their experience. And so they, like I said, they declined. And yet, interestingly enough, when Shelterwood hosted community events, inviting people who had historic relationships with the camp to contribute to the future visioning of the camp, they invited all the folks that had were part of the CCO and people that had gone to camp there and had a special memory in their lives because they wanted to know what they envisioned for the camp. So Shelter would even still extend to them, which I thought was while still having strong boundaries in other places, but I thought that was very generous of them. I know I just downloaded a lot of details, and I hope that getting to go deeper into understanding this journey can help all of us understand those thresholds and how we would navigate them differently. And I just want to give us a chance, and myself a chance, to take a break and for a breath. And maybe a few moments to just reflect on anything that came up for you about hearing more details of that story than you have heard before.
Thank you, Cass. It is very true. We have a bulky amount of content for today, and so I do hope that there was a moment that people had to write anything down that came up for you in relation to this case study. There's a lot of potent information there. And with that said, in the training today, we are going to have a decent amount of time in the second half for some Q&A, for reflection questions about how to approach land transitions and the strategies that title holders might use. If more questions or things come up, please write them down, and we will have a chance again to dive into more questions. But right now, we're actually going to press forward. And so, something to understand the context of some of the story that Cass just shared, this case study, is diving into rupture and repair. So I want to take a few minutes right now just to talk about rupture and repair and what we mean by this, because with that case study, there's a lot of moments of pain and of rupture and of an intention being set by an organization with allegedly good intentions, but unfortunately not really meeting that in a meaningful way. And one context that we can use to understand what it's like to work as title holders with BIPOC organizations is a framework of rupture and repair. And rupture and repair is this concept that I'm going to start with. The settler colonial history of marginalizing BIPOC folks and seeking to erase their culture has created a state of untended ruptures. In order to do repair, we must understand the ruptures in relationship with the land and its historic inhabitants caused by our ancestors. We acknowledge that ruptures of the past create a context that makes micro ruptures and microaggressions prevalent in interactions today. And we can work on developing skills to identify current ruptures when they happen and appropriate responses of repair. I'm going to leave these here for a moment and just allow people to take them in a little bit more. Just with the extra suggestion of really pulling us to this space of understanding that this isn't just about this moment. Of course, rupture and repair is about the historic context of the land, and really trying to hold that as we move forward with the work. As we acknowledge this context of rupture in history, of actions and things that have happened in the past that are a part of oppression, a part of racism, a part of taking advantage and harm of other human life, a big step for people to step into this justice work is self-reflection and figuring out your own histories, your own narratives that have brought you to this moment. And so one big activity that is its own threshold moment that could be for your group or your organization is to really sit together and to work on truth and storytelling for you, for the land that you steward, and for your organization. And I'm just going to read from this slide. Conduct an honest assessment of what is the story of the land, including the involvement of your ancestors of blood, ethnicity, and spiritual affiliation, including the story of your own history and involvement up to the present day. And while you're doing this, you can consider the human to human relationships and also the human to land relationships in this story. This is a really significant piece because the ability for you and your group to come together and to be on the same terms of understanding of the story of your organization or the story of the land that you own or tend. That truth is a really big piece of how you will present yourself in the future to potential groups who might be stepping into stewardship. It's also true that Nuns and Nuns is working on creating a specific activity for this, still in development. And so I know they will be touching back in at a later date with a more structured activity. With that said, this activity of reflecting on truth and storytelling can start right now. And now diving in, continuing along with ruptures and repair and internal accountability, that storytelling piece, truth and storytelling, is a component of trying to create internal accountability for your group. Because you hopefully will come out of it with a similar story, a similar narrative that you all share. And I want to introduce some other elements of internal accountability with the reminder that we all need emotional and spiritual support on our journeys of justice work. And creating the structures for that support is an essential piece to make sure you're prepared. And so before engaging with BIPOC community, it's essential that a support group of peers is created so that you can share and explore your values, your feelings, your concerns, etc., about the work ahead. And now some of this stuff are examples of what we did a little bit of in part 1 and 2 of the training. But truly, these are things that need to be continued and need their own space. Your own organizations need the space to practice identifying microaggressions and racist assumptions. I know that in one of the breakout sessions that I visited from the last trainings, people were practicing calling in members in their own group. And it's a very challenging thing to look at someone who you care about, who you have a lot of compassion for, who you've maybe been a friend of for many, many years. And it's challenging to look at that person and say, I think that what you just said was a racist assumption. Can we talk more about that, or can we examine that more? And that practice is a really big deal because If that comes up in a moment where you're interfacing with potential future stewards and you notice that someone is saying something or acting in a way that feels out of alignment with your group's values, it's imperative that you have that practice of pulling that person closer and being able to hold them in loving accountability. And the more our teams are able to develop trust by engaging in difficult conversations, the stronger we all become in doing justice-oriented work. And a big part of this statement is that we're developing our teams, that it's not about any of us individually, it's about the teams that we're working with. And creating internal accountability is a process and will also bring you so much closer. Something else about rupture and repair is that when you actually get into the meetings, when you do have a facilitator, when you figured out what your offer is, you're beginning to meet with BIPOC groups, it's really important to accept that you will mess up. And with that said, and you've likely heard this before, it's not appropriate when you mess up or if you have a sudden response to something that comes up in that meeting session, it's not appropriate to process grief or shame with the BIPOC folks who are around in that container, especially about micro ruptures or microaggressions that have happened in that moment or happened at another time in your experience. It's not just rude, it's just highly inappropriate to sort of tether someone in a meeting and hope that they will be able to hold a negative experience that you had before. And of course, you do need someone, you need people to be able to hold a space where you get to talk about your experiences of witnessing racism, witnessing micro or macroaggressions, but it's not in the times when you're interfacing with these groups about a land transition. And with that said, mistakes happen and we will mess up. And when micro ruptures or microaggressions happen, we need to focus on our reparative actions, which is acknowledging that it happened, apologizing, recommitting ourselves to actions of repair, and getting back to work. A few more specific tools for working with groups in real time is pay attention and do more listening than talking. If you cause a microaggression or rupture, take a step back. Taking a step back is a big deal because more harm can be done if an aggression or rupture happens and you step forward and take up more space because of that. It can be very challenging and it's something to practice. It's something that I practice as an educator, that if something sort of big and attention getting happens, to really try to hold space for it and make sure that the flow continues in the room so that whatever happened that caused a pause or a stop doesn't take over the whole space. And a part of that for you might be leaning into the trust that you will have a chance to unpack whatever happened later outside of that meeting. And a piece, again, was mentioned before, but worth saying again, that practice for how you respond to a rupture, to an aggression, is really important, because if you've practiced it, you will do better at acknowledging it in a respectful way when you're in a meeting with other people. And a big, big tool that is so essential to this is making sure that you have internal review sessions for your group, ideally after each meeting, so that you can reflect on how it went. If there are pieces of feedback that you want to deliver to anyone else in your group. Those type of things are common practice for a lot of justice-oriented work, so that no one feels like they are alone in their feelings about what happened, that there is an intentional container for holding space for your reflections, for your reactions, etc. Justice-oriented work is not about a single moment. It is about a sequence of decisions made through a process. And a big piece of why CELT is able to offer a list of threshold moments for land transitions is really trying to emphasize how justice in land transitions isn't about any specific one moment that is the hinge moment that everything depends on. It does depend on a sequence of decisions. And each time you show up to that moment, you have the power to step into your ethical alignment and make a decision in a more ethical and just way. And if we know that it's a sequence of decisions, when we do mess up, we know that we can reassess our alignment and we can step forward into the next moment of decision making.
Jason, do you mind if I say something here?
Oh, go ahead.
I really want to share that with most BIPOC groups that I work with, there's a whole trust building arc that has to happen. But then once I am trusted to be in the group and work with the group, then I get to have this experience of working shoulder to shoulder together to dismantle an unjust situation. And that there's nothing like having a land transition as the goal of working shoulder to shoulder together. And that having a land transition as our North Star it really helps organize those rupture and repair experiences, because I get a chance over and over again, like after I say something that I really wish I wouldn't have said, and I held myself back from processing it in an inappropriate context, I know that the next time I show up, the next meeting that we're at, that my repair and action is actually going to speak louder than any of the words that I could have said to acknowledge and apologize. And sometimes it's appropriate to acknowledge and apologize. And there's something so powerful about coming back to it and showing up to the meeting, knowing 100% in your heart that you're there for their land reunion, and that you're shoulder to shoulder working together to co-create that future together. So I just wanted to kind of put a little plug in for what that alignment towards the repair and action of the land transition itself. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Cass. Yeah, and I think just with what you just spoke about, it emphasizes what it's like to be focusing on the action of repair, and being involved in a process really opens up the opportunity for actions of repair to be something we get to engage in. And that's very different than a statement of intentions, because the action is what speaks. And so just briefly, we have back to here our 9 threshold moments. These are the ones that we used for the CCO and Shelterwood case study. And again, these are appearing in a document, the threshold moments document, that has been shared with everyone already. And I just want to briefly mention a few additional threshold moments for title holders, because the case study threshold moments didn't include many of the ones that are actually more justice and equity land transition oriented. And so, for example, some additional threshold moments are, like we mentioned, the truth and storytelling activity, an internal assessment of the story of your organization, the story of the land, and your approach to land justice. Another one is, does your organization want to make a meaningful apology to local BIPOC communities? Another one, what is your internal support plan? What is the practice that you intend to have for how you're going to navigate challenging conversations? When will you reflect on the process, and what tools of accountability are you using? Are you planning to meet local Black, Indigenous, and POC communities? This is a really big one. What is your internal assessment of the land intended to be transitioned? Is it simple or is it complicated? What is the status of the facility? That's deepening into the question that I know many groups have talked about, of how can life estates be included in land transitions and such things. Another really big one, creating a multicultural advisory council to explore different perspectives of what to do with the land. I know that CELT has witnessed groups creating such councils, not at a later stage when, when the land is already for sale or process is underway, but actually to support the creation of the process by bringing people in to be in those conversations. Identifying different people and roles who should be present in conversations and support the process. That's such as facilitators, such as real estate agents, such as cultural representatives. And finally, getting to know the land more intimately and gather more information. Each of these things in our document, the threshold moments for title holders in land transitions, in that document, each of these points have more information with some specific examples of what each of these different pieces, different threshold moments can actually look like. So I really do want to encourage each of you in your own groups or in your own time to really take a look at that document and spend a little bit of time with it. And it might be what really helps you figure out your next steps and your plan that your organization has to move forward. All right, we've done so much talking already. We're going to have a very brief break of 4 minutes to invite people to use the restroom or whatever they need to do. And when we come back, we're going to begin diving into elements of genuine offers, and we're going to start our Q&A time. So we'll see you very soon. This organization could have approached their land transition differently. We are about to dive into some very specific examples of different ways to approach land transitions. And with that said, it's worthy of reflecting on how you think our example, our case study, could have been approached differently. All right, time for us to be back. Thank you, everyone. Now, I'm curious for people to still hold on to any responses you might have to this reflection question of what you think the Christian organization could have done differently. Because we really want to jump into some very, very specific examples of genuine offers and false offers. And I'm wondering, Cass, would you be willing to talk about these two slides?
Absolutely. And we are going to have a chance to hear from you all and talk about various aspects of this really shortly. So I know we've been hearing a lot from us this morning or this afternoon, and I'm looking forward to also hearing from you and talking about this. So the elements of genuine land offers, it's really important that we obviously study what doesn't work. And so the Lyell, Redbird, and L. Frank helped us understand what some of the false land offers feel like as well. So a hollow declaration to Indigenous tribes, this is your land, I know that, but without actually working to grant legal or structural access to that land is unfortunately all too common. We also see that we could invite BIPOC groups to step into existing structures or stewardships that are already happening on our land the way that we have it set up, and inviting them to step into the way that we've got it going without granting new groups agency to come in and have culturally affirmative, tending the land in their way. And obviously that kind of an offer comes with so many strings attached that L. Frank So kind of painfully reminds us that when there's an exchange, that often those strings feel like chains. So another false offer is when title holders express the interest in land justice, but then still use a conventional system, like we saw with the Shelterwood and CCO story. Without proper support, it's just too easy to fall into a conventional way of doing things, prioritizing the highest bidder and participating in a competitive real estate situation, as well as not really diving into the land and sharing the information that's needed for an actual positive outcome. So these are all ways that that without proper support, we might not be making real offers of healing. So what are the elements of a genuine land offer? Well, what we're here wanting to help you do is figure out your situation, your values, the terms of what you're offering before interfacing. So doing that deep internal work, taking the time, getting the support, which is so beautiful. That's why we're here and helping to really get the soil ready for something beautiful to grow before just trying to, throw plants in the ground, like really cultivating this. So we're explicitly stating where you need to, where for various reasons you may need to retain control, and where there's full agency for new stewards or new title holders to engage the land on their own terms. So if there are needs or stipulations, like life estates, like some pre-existing conditions, making those really clear. And if you want to have future involvement, obviously you need to say that, but behave as a person, as people that are are really doing the work to stay in healthy, ongoing relationship. There's also, it's important that you state whether this is going to be a market price or a discount, and do the appraisal work ahead of time to go ahead and talk about that, so that burden doesn't fall on future land stewards. And I think really an important thing that is just such a beautiful piece is that even as you're engaging with a land transition, this can be your way of deepening your relationship with the land, to seeing that this isn't just about letting go of land that perhaps you've been stewarding or the church has been stewarding for a while. This is a way of entering into the story about the land and going backwards in time to understand its history, participating in stewarding a future beyond your own time. And so even as you're relinquishing a particular ownership situation or stewardship context, even as you're relinquishing that, you could perceive and actually be deepening your stewardship of the land and understanding that is your commitment going deeper into the land rather than just like letting it go. So I think that's just a frame that can live in your hearts, is very genuine as you engage this process.
Thank you, Cass. We're about to jump into a very practical tool, which is our Genuine Offers and Ethical Land Transitions rubric. And so for the next while, we have a full 40 minutes for this. So we're trying to take our time to move through it. I'm going to read through one strand at a time of our rubric of one of the tenets of a genuine author and ethical land transition. And I do want to invite people who are participants today, if you do have a printed copy in front of you, consider highlighting or underlining any part on the rubric that you resonate with. It's just an extra little help that can support understanding of the different pieces of the rubric and what you connect with. And if you have any questions, make note of them. After each strand, we will have some time to answer a few questions. And so this is a time to bring in your personal questions for each of these things. And if you do have a question, please use the hand raise feature, and we will move to that after each of them. Also, I'm going to jump into the describing each strand, and I'm going to ask Cass to rate our CCO and Shelterwood experience on the strand. The first one, sovereignty for new stewards. Does this land transition offer the new title holders sovereignty / agency of how they wish to steward the land? You'll notice on these rubrics that a 4 score is the highest to uphold the tenant or the question, that is the title of the strand, and the 1 and the 0 is the lowest. And so in the most ideal of circumstance, new title holders get to have full sovereignty and agency to choose how to steward the land in the future and who will be involved without imposing others. Prior title holders fully relinquish power and influence pertaining to the land. And as we move down this rubric, we notice 3 is title holders have sovereignty and agency, except for predetermined, formalized, and consented upon agreements. This is still a really great place to be. If there are ways that prior title holders need to have some type of access or some type of agency for a piece moving forward in the future, at least it is done with formalized agreements so that everyone knows that it's happening. Everyone is in agreement and consents to it happening. We go further down. For a 2, new title holders will have some agency, but there are strings attached and specific factors are present that limit steward agency, such as the land must be tended in collaboration with a separate organization. This could still be done with consent and with, a formal agreement. It could be done with transparency and awareness, but it is calling out the concept that it is an extra layer to ask new stewards to be working in collaboration with a different organization, especially because sovereignty is so much about the agency of new groups, of BIPOC groups being able to steward the land in a way that is culturally affirmative for them. And finally, 1 and 0, future stewards don't really have sovereignty as part of this land transition. And an entity other than the new land stewards make the decisions about how the land will be used and tended. And I'm curious, Cass, where do you think the CCO and Shelterwood example falls on this?
Well, interestingly, they get a 4 on this because they paid $4 million and they went through a very conventional real estate process. They ended up with complete sovereignty.
It's interesting I know in here, therein lies an interesting conversation about what happens if a conventional sale does take place, which is sometimes a conventional sale means that an emerging stewardship group does get to have all of the agency and sovereignty for being willing to play the game.
But very few BIPOC groups have that level of funding behind them.
I see. So I'm going to stop share so that we can come back to the room. And if you do have that rubric in front of you, it is helpful right now for if you have any questions. I'm curious if anyone has any specific questions right now about this piece.
There's a question in the chat about the role of mineral rights in land transitions, which is a great question. And I actually I've worked with water rights, but not mineral rights. But I'm curious about that. And I believe that they convey with the land, that they run with the land, just like water rights do. So I'm curious maybe you know something about that you can educate about what the mineral rights are.
I'm aware, just in my experience with mineral rights on land, that it can be a separate entity that owns the mineral rights to land, and that doing that work ahead of time is very important because there is land where power companies, mining companies do still own the mineral rights to that land. And so that's important stuff to know ahead of time. I think that it's common though for people to already have that awareness, but not always, because there's land that is sold at a huge discount because power companies still own the rights to mine on that land. Would love to go to Susan.
Yeah, I'm wondering about sovereignty and conservation easements into perpetuity. We're just on the verge of finalizing a conservation easement. It's an agricultural easement, so flexibility for agriculture and certainly stipulations about how the land can be used in the future in terms of number of buildings and that kind of thing. So I'm just curious your response to conservation easements.
And so can you tell me a little bit more that you're doing the conservation easements, the church is putting conservation easements on land that you hold title to, and are you planning on doing any other transitions with that land, or is it more just you're curious about the nature of the agriculture or a conservation easement?
So the easement is set up so that it's almost 900 acres. It can be divided into parcels and sold, but the easement restrictions will always go with the title.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, we would love to see BIPOC communities, farmers have access to that land or buy that land. I mean, it would be sold. And it's sold with stipulations. So I'm just curious as I think about sovereignty.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. And it also is interesting to think about who's holding those easements, what land trust or agency is enforcing those easements, who sits on their board, what is their values and like their trajectory as an organization, because that also will influence how they interface with those easements and what other programming they might be able to bring to bear with regard to helping with access. Because sometimes I think those things can work and they just can work in different ways. And we can think we're doing a really good thing by protecting the ecology in perpetuity, and protecting from development rights, and no matter what, if that but anyway, sometimes it can veer off into another direction that then doesn't prioritize easements. Has it been something that you've considered with cultural easements?
I'm not sure what cultural easements are.
The cultural easements are they're similar to conservation easements, but they're done with local tribes to give access to for cultural purposes, for either tending plants, having ceremonies and sacred sites, doing having a cultural relationship with the land that also can be held and enforced by a trust that then helps support that kind of access as well. That might be something to look into.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I also have a response to Susan's question that is just, in my experience, working with or being aware of the work that community land trusts do, sometimes with one that I'm familiar with, there is this is what's on paper, but here is our kind of verbal agreement with the landowner that, oh, we don't actually come and monitor that often. We're not actually very imposing on the activities of the land, but we do come in and do our inspections to uphold the land trust and the easement. And something that I would caution about that is that that's the territory where people, I think, can more often favor people who are similar to them and may not have that same familial neighborly relationship with BIPOC groups in the same way. Because I think that there's a lot of, sort of unofficial agreement that can come up between those organizations, and moving forward, not assuming that that organization is actually going to be as agreeable or as willing to have like the benefit of the doubt for a BIPOC group means that you might have some work going forward with that community land trust or whatever the entity is to really investigate what their values are. And if they're willing to state anything or publish anything about their values for BIPOC groups. I think that would be an incredible way to do work ahead of time,
Mhm.
just to make sure that the values of the land trust are not preferential for people that they're already familiar with, they're already their neighbors, things like
Okay.
that.
Thank you.
Sarah?
Hello, yes. Thank you so much, Susan, for bringing that up. I think my question is really, I kind of want to press on this a little bit more because I do think it's the case for a lot of religious communities that they have been exploring easements, conservation, agriculture, and otherwise. And I'm just curious if there's more you can share about working with values aligned land trusts or whatever entity is holding the easement that BIPOC stewards have had positive experiences with in terms of their agency and their sovereignty and their like culturally affirming stewardship, even with limitations of an easement. And if there's just any like really clear things you can look for or ask and request or put down on paper with that entity that's holding the easement that can make those things more possible, can make a healthy relationship more possible.
I wish I had more examples of land trusts having really great relationships with BIPOC communities. Unfortunately, I don't have that many great examples. One of the organizations in our area called Land Paths that is having really good relationship is they're less they do hold title and conserve land, and they are expressly about access. So I think that's one of the, there's a thing that land trusts are undergoing right now, which is an inquiry about this preserve and protect model, which actually isn't about access for human beings of any kind in many ways. And so there's like some assumptions inside of the way that we've historically been thinking about land trusts and conservation easements. That is needing iteration. And so organizations like Land Paths that are specifically about access for like appropriate, well-supported access for communities that don't usually have access is, I think, I hope a direction that we see more conservation organizations going.
And I would add as a note to that it's also really worth searching even just on the internet to find out if there are any BIPOC-led community land trusts who are holding land in trust. I only know of one, but I know that it exists, and I know that their reach is expanding and their involvement is expanding, and that's research to be doing as well.
And what Sarah just said about Indigenous-led land trusts, like what Segorite is doing right now, and other Indigenous land trusts that are getting that can hold the easements, I think is really that's a really important growth path.
All right, and I'm going to jump back into so we can move forward with our second strand of our rubric, which is future involvement, which I know is a big conversation for a lot of people who are in the room today. The question that guides this strand is, do the previous title holders express their interest in future involvement? And how do they act if relationships degrade? A great example, a floor for this, is that prior title holders clearly state and negotiate their desires for future involvement in conversations with the new stewards. And that if conflict arises, the new steward's vision of how to care for the land is prioritized. Previous title holders graciously step back if asked. And this minimizes the emotional labor that's taken on by the new stewards to tend those relationships. Doesn't mean that they won't be present in some way for them, but taking away emotional labor, it means that they won't have to be in these long, enduring sort of conflicts, holding or being expected to tend in a big way to those connections because they've already been talked about. As we go down, a 3 is that prior title holders clearly state and negotiate their desires for future involvement in conversations, same thing with the new stewards. Once again, if conflict arises, the steward's vision of how to care for the land is prioritized. And this level 3 has the sort of asterisk that previous title holders might have some difficulty in stepping back. And there might be more enduring, challenging conversations or conflicts or things that happen that impose labor on the new stewards. And so in this scenario, the agreements were set. Everything was set up. Things happened in a way where consensus or consent was given to the type of relationship, the type of future involvement. But then the previous title holders still have a hard time upholding those things. What is still great about that for the level 3 is that there still are the clearly stated agreements from the negotiations, and that's a really big deal. For a level 2, prior title holders may state desires for future involvement, but then prioritize their own beliefs about what should happen with the land, and they may be challenging to work with. This results in substantial emotional labor for the new stewards and imposes on their ability to thrive. I think, unfortunately, this is something that CELT more often than not witnesses. And finally, our lowest one for a 1 or a 0 is that prior title holders may or may not be clear about their desires for future involvement. If the future involvement does not happen in a way that pleases them, they may make unanticipated demands or become an oppositional force seeking to harm and slander the new stewards. This is also something that CELT has witnessed. And Cass, I want to ask you, on this scale, how do you think CCO and Shelter would score?
I would give them a 1.5. I think that they didn't take it so far as to slander, but I think that there has been maybe 1.5 is generous, so maybe closer to a 1. Yeah, because obviously the only thing that they did is they stated clearly that they wanted future involvement, but how they handled that was so poorly. So
I want to hang out on this slide for just 20, 30 more seconds when people generate any questions that they have about this. All right. And I don't see any hands raised right now at the outset, but I still want to give some time in case anything percolates.
I'm curious about this notion of future involvement and just sort of what stirs for people in terms of in your heart of hearts, how you would like to see that happen.
Right, I think that I might move on with the rubric just because, although Cass just asked a more general question, if we get through this rubric, we'll have a little more time for general questions about that, about envisioning the future and what type of future relationship people are trying to have. So. Right, strand 3, which is the seller or current title holder needs. Does the offer directly state any stipulations about the land transition up front? This is, of course, a big tenet, big piece of what doing the work ahead of time with your organization is, to make sure that you know the details of the land, what you might need for the future, any stipulations, anything that is essential for the potential future stewards to know ahead of time. So a score 4 on this strand is current title holder is very clear and upfront with any needs they have regarding the land transition at the beginning of conversations, well before escrow or advancing the transition process. A score 3, title holder is mostly clear about their needs regarding the land transition, but may initially withhold this information or may have needs that shift during the process. Still, the needs are shared before escrow to allow time to reflect on if the parties are a fit. Escrow, of course, is an important piece of this because escrow represents being in contract and represents money already being on the line in the form of a down payment. And so, or it's not called a down payment, Cass can correct me. Score 2 is current title holder is only somewhat aware of their needs, or their needs aren't shared until escrow, putting undue stress and time constraint on the new title holders. And finally, the current title holder doesn't know their needs, or their needs may shift erratically over time before, during, or after the land transition. And what do you think, Cassandra? Where did the Christian Church Organization and Shelterwood, their transaction rate on this?
Well, it's interesting because they had certain clear needs with regard to selling it quickly and for a lot of money. And so that once again, the conventional real estate process was good at holding that. However, other needs and desires that they had were not as clearly shared. So I guess I would put them in the kind of in the middle, maybe in the 2, between 2 and 3.
I would mention that a big piece about this rubric strand really has to do, again, with the upfront work before going on the market or before going about an off-market transition, and really preparing as an organization to know what your needs are and to know what conversations need to happen before you begin engaging in the further process. So I'm gonna again leave this up for about 20 more seconds and then see if we have any questions specifically about this. All right, yeah, Brenna.
Hi, I mostly just wanted to lift up Beth Piggish's comment in the chat about some sisters may have a natural burial site on their property, and I was wondering would you see that as like desiring future involvement or a stipulation? I feel like it could maybe be in one or the other, and how would you distinguish that?
It's a both and. That's a great, and thank you for lifting that up. I was wanting to understand that more myself. And that's something that, yeah, it's fascinating. I think it's actually kind of I'm really curious about how that can be lifted up in a way of honoring your ancestors and being able to have a place to visit and to pray and to be able to name that as a condition. That's an important thing for that. And sadly, unfortunately, that's been taken away from Native communities across the country. And so when we lift up like, oh, like as if that hasn't been systemically erased. Their burial sites haven't been systemically erased across the country, but it's more to join together in that, I think, that human and very important desire to honor the dead. So I think that that could be an opportunity as well as a understandable need going forward to have a relationship with that natural burial site. And I've seen real estate transitions that have that be that's just part of it. Like, this is when the visiting hours are. This is, yep, your house may be over there, but that people always have access down the road to go down to visit the burial site. And so it just gets really clearly articulated, and carried forward with humility, that and compassion, that if you are working with an Indigenous community, that they may have had that erased, and so that there's sensitivity around that, and that you want for them access to their burial sites, of course. And so just staying in solidarity there around something that feels so understandable.
Yeah, I would just emphasize that I think of what Cass just talked about as a great example of having your plan or your needs really upfront, because then they can be engaged with in a meaningful way. And also I heard in there the acknowledgement of the, frankly, the desecration of burial sites of Indigenous folks. I think that the need and the reverence for space for the dead is something that I think really can unite people. And that's a big piece. Also, knowing that that's something that can be talked about ahead of time, and that agreement can be made in good faith for a good purpose, and isn't something that comes up later on as an expectation. Let's go to Linda.
Yes, I really appreciate this presentation. In an effort to understand it better, I'm still thinking a little bit about future involvement and the Shelterwood situation, as well as the needs. I was wondering, Cassandra, if you could articulate a little bit more what the desired future involvement was on the part of the CCO, that then they fell down on. And the unarticulated needs, I was trying to imagine what they were other than making money and sell fast. Was it like looking good in the process of that, or escape from liability, future liability? Or I just wondered if you could articulate those two things a little bit more.
Okay, I got the first one about their future, what giving a clear picture of what future involvement they would have liked. And
yes.
then, and I'm sorry, and I want to make sure I understand the second.
And the other, you said they were pretty clear that they wanted to make, their needs were to make money and to sell fast. But and then you said, but a little less transparent about other needs. I was just trying to imagine what those other needs were.
Yeah. Thank you. And they were really, because they're a huge organization, and there were people who were much closer to the ground than the people who are making decisions. We got different signals from different people. Okay. And so it was also challenging for us to interpret all of their, so it was confusing, like what messages we were getting, because we had people that we only ever saw on Zoom who signed the papers, and then people who lived locally, who took care of the site, who were more in touch, that we actually met. And so, but the people who were signing the papers are the people we were in legal contract with. And then the other folks, the ones who were actually just more human beings, who had, and I'm not saying those people weren't human beings. I have a lot of compassion for the ones who were elected to make all those decisions, because they were in a lot of pressure, but they couldn't show their humanity as much because they were inside of this legally binding context. So we had a series of, we had contact with them before we got into contract. And in that contact, we had sort of like, there was a bit of a rose-colored picture that started to emerge, because one of their resolutions was actually about racial equity inside of the camp experience. So like, for the people who have access to going to camps, how they as a church could help really bring like racial healing into that experience. Shelterwood would have been an incredible partner to co-create that kind of experience. but what happened is that like something as collaborative as that didn't happen, but even just them having access so that they could have like an annual, they could rent the camp, pay a rental rate and just have access to the camp for a year. I mean, not a year, but a week or 2 weeks, once a year to get to have like a Camp Cazadero reunion. That they would have loved to have that. And so things like this were expressed in this early kind of like, oh, this could be really beautiful. But then it went cutthroat really fast. And so then no longer were we inside of that co-visioning of how this could really be good for them and good for Shelterwood. And it could have been there could have been mutuality at the table. It transitioned into a who gets the highest bidding, who gets the highest price bidding war. And then that just it's like it just distorts the field super intensely. And then that coupled with the lack of disclosure, with their misrepresenting the condition of the forest, them not telling us about a bunch of stuff, the trust level just sunk. And so then Shelterwood was like, well, I guess we're pressurized into meeting their financial and time needs, and all of that beautiful possibility just like it was like the balloon got popped. And so then anything that they could have sort of, like the people who are closer to the ground, like there is still some relationship between the person takes care of the water systems, like they care for each other because they care for the land together with Shelterwood. But in terms of the church as a whole, and then with that invitation afterwards to come to an event but not speak about the purchase price, and it just, the trust was just tanked. Did that speak to your questions, Linda?
Yeah, that is helpful. And I think it's something for religious communities like mine to be thinking about, that we start with, a concept that is really positive and hopeful, but then as we consult various professionals out of our culture, then you say, well, you can't really do that because of the liability or because of whatever. And so then if we've been in dialogue with another group, that the messaging might start to change without even really being too transparent about why we're having to make this dream or hope smaller or change the thing. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And you bring up a lot of good points, actually, right inside of what you just said. And I hope we have time in other contexts to unpack some of those liability thresholds. Kathy asked about the time being the elephant in the room. That was absolutely that's one of the things that if you couldn't, for various reasons, discount a land that you were selling, you can't, but you say you had time to offer. You could say, hey, we can work with you for a full year or 6 months or something to help you get this land. And that would be really different than even if you had to sell it to them and help them raise the money or whatnot. I hope I'm being clear that sometimes time can actually really be an extension of solidarity when for other reasons your hands might be tied financially. So I want to name that just added sort of insult to injury on the Shelterwood case, because we paid top dollar and we sprinted in the impact of the time crunch on them was horrible for their team, because they were really seeking to operate in a much more healing and decolonial practice, but not everybody can just appease and perform inside of that kind of a time frame. So their team really suffered, because those who could just put their feelings down and just run the race, they made it through. Other members of their team that were much more highly sensitive and did more of the emotional labor didn't actually, like, they got really damaged by the process, by the time. And discernment takes time. Yeah.
I think that I would like to jump back into our rubric for a little bit longer, and I still see your hand, Linda. I would love for you to hold on to that. I think that what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a drive-by of our last strands of the rubric so that then we can open up for general questions. So I noticed that the questions right now are encompassing, not just about one sort of specific piece, which makes sense. These are complicated things. Right, so we have our strand 4 of the rubric, which is honesty and transparency. And our guiding question is, have all of the details regarding the health and function of the land and facility been investigated, documented, and shared? For 4 points, the land and facilities have been thoroughly inspected and assessed for the condition of the structures and health of the ecosystems and wildlife present. This information and the history of the land is openly shared with prospective new title holders. For number 3, the land and facilities have been fairly well inspected and assessed for condition of the structures and health of the ecosystems and wildlife present. Same as 4, just fairly well versus thoroughly. For 2, the land and facilities may have been inspected and assessed for condition, but these details are poorly communicated, or they're shared late in the transition process, which might come across as misleading to the prospective new title holders. And the lowest score, little to no effort was made to understand the condition of the structures, the health of the ecosystems and wildlife, or anything before engaging in the transition. And the current title holders may come across as opaque and disinterested. And I'm going to jump back to Cassandra and ask, where did our CCO and Shelterwood transition fall on this?
It was a 1 in the 1-0 zone, but I think that's obvious from the stories Harvey shared.
Yeah, for sure. All right. And our 5th strand of the rubric, land back and reparations. Guiding question, to what extent does the land transition involve direct gift, discount, and or funding for legal services? For 4, the land transition will bequest the land outright to BIPOC folks. Prior title holders may even develop creative ways to pay for legal fees, property taxes, etc., to prioritize future stewardship of the land and lessen the impact of capitalism. That's a really big deal, because it costs a lot of money to be represented in order to purchase land or even to receive land if it's not a conventional transaction. And I think many people in this room are likely familiar with the legal fees and consulting fees that may be involved in trying to buy land or trying to sell land. For number 3, the land is sold to BIPOC folks at a substantial discount on the appraised or market value. Number 2, the land is sold to BIPOC folks for the full appraised value, but price reductions may be incorporated for necessary repairs that were not noted in the appraisal. And that's, number 2 is still a conventional system, but it's leaning on the care side of the spectrum still, at least somewhat, acknowledging where price reduction should happen for facilities or for land that is in disrepair. And finally, the lowest score, the land transition prioritizes profit, and the land is sold to the highest bidder in the competitive market, which may well be above the appraised value of the property. I think that is obvious, but Cassandra,
That's where we're at in our case study.
Okay. Yeah, this is another big internal conversation of, how do the values of your organization translate into specific actions? And this is a very action-oriented strand of this rubric, which is, it is in many ways your duty to figure out ahead of time what you intend the gift or the land back or the reparations to be. And our last strand is a meaty one, and it, might come across as a little more esoteric for some people, but we still think it's really important to highlight, which is the land as entity. Our guiding question: do the current title holders regard the land as sacred and sovereign? How do they value those who currently or have historically tended the land? And so this is the land as entity, and it's the past, present, and future of the land being held. For a 4, title holders have a high-touch relationship with the land and involve those who have historically tended the land and who are active stewards in their decision-making process. Involving those people in the decision-making process is a really big piece of this score 4. The story of the land itself, past, present, and future, for generations to come, is central. The land transfers to those who are original peoples or others who have a multi-generational stewardship ethic. And this is a standpoint potentially that the prior title holders believe that the transfer of the land to original peoples, to indigenous folks, to BIPOC folks, and those who are caring for the future, a multi-generational future of the land, that is more valuable to them than money. That's a really big tenet of what we imagine is one of the highest forms of relationship with the land as an entity, just caring for the advanced future of the land outside of the land being commodified. For the 3, we have title holders are in genuine relationship with the people who currently care for the land or who have historically tended the land, and they seek their wisdom and guidance. But none of these land tenders are invited to be directly involved with decisions. It's still a big deal to be in consult and counsel with historic people who have tended the land and people who currently tend the land. And it's a big step to invite them into a decision-making process, but we don't want to downplay the significance of having them on your team and bringing them in and holding space for their voices. For a score 2, title holders express a romantic appreciation for the beauty of the land, and they might even have fond memories of the time they spent on the land, but they don't substantiate their care with a sense of actual accountability or relationship to the land. Nor do they have that relationship with people who have historically tended the land. And these title holders can't or don't know how to meaningfully involve those people, those historic tenders or current stewards in the transition. And finally, our lowest score, the title holders see the land as an asset and a liability. And the decision makers know little about the land, except that it is costly to own land, to sell land. To have a facility on land always costs money, even if you don't do anything with it. Decisions about the land are made solely through the lens of financial and legal considerations. This is a big one because this is a very, some people describe the land as entity as a part of a cosmic alignment of human relationship with land, and where each of us sits on this spectrum of how we engage with the land as an entity. It's a very personal question. It's a very personal relationship. I'm curious, Cassandra, if you can reflect again on our case study and where they would score.
Well, they definitely mostly regarded, like the people we interacted with that were, quote, selling the land, and the decision makers saw the land as an asset and a liability. And so they were definitely scored mostly 1, but there were people who had a strong what I would say romantic appreciation for the land, and lots of fond memories and lots of desire to somehow stay, to kind of grasp hold of the idea that they could stay in relationship with the land somehow. But because of that cross purposes with the church actually acting more in such a conventional way in the real estate market, then they weren't actually, able to honor what might have been more than a romantic. It could have been very spiritual. I'm sure as a church, people had spiritual experiences on that land, connecting with God, and the land held that for them, and I'm sure that was very real for them. but they weren't able to find their way to expressing that in the way that a real estate transaction played out. So I'd give them a 1 with 2 sprinkled all over the place.
Thank you for that reflection. So this is the end of our rubric, and I want to remind everyone again that this is a tool that you can print out your own version, and in the worksheet that was emailed to everyone, there is a single strand printed on each page so that you can dissect this more and try to come up with some next steps for you or for your organization in relation to these things. With that said, I'm going to stop sharing the screen and come back to the full group and just invite general questions or reflections right now. I know that in this presentation, we had some very specific times for questions, and we haven't held space yet really for any larger encompassing questions or comments that people have. So really want to make some space for that. Let's go to Brenna.
Thanks for letting me speak again. Just that last strand that you put up there reminded me of just some feedback we're getting as nuns and nuns with people we're consulting with to look into even the very practical, like you talked about the previous people who've tended the land and the land herself. But some of those previous people may, for example, have been enslaved on that land because some land might have been formerly a plantation, for example, or some land may have included a boarding school and may have burial sites. So those are just 2 very practical examples of who else needs to be in conversation about what happens to the land. And I'm thinking of a specific example, I can't remember which community it was, where that was the case, where the land was a former plantation and there were burial sites of formerly enslaved people who were not, and their descendants weren't consulted in the sale. And so just the importance of doing that assessment and storytelling tool, Jason, that you talked about before, of looking who has previously tended that land, what stories does this land hold, and who needs to be in that conversation before decisions, because the major things like burial sites, but also other things could be a part of that conversation. And you may have mentioned this, my Zoom was cutting in and out, sorry, but we are, nuns and nuns, we are developing such an assessment tool that asks those kinds of questions to try to help communities think through what kinds of questions to be asking and answering about the history of their own land and community. So thank you.
It's so important what you're doing with that, because the journey of asking those questions and coming to understand how you are in the story of the land, like your journey is embedded in the land, is holding this history, and that whether as you contemplate what is your right relationship with that land, that courageous act of asking those questions and doing that research and being willing to look, and then hopefully having an advisory council that can help you with that discernment, so that you're not just trying to sort that out on your own. Although I just really respect that, the courage to make those inquiries.
And as we give some space for people to reflect on other questions, just want to encourage participants to be considering what they're taking away from things that were presented today. And also, if you have what comes up for you in terms of your list of next steps. And you know, I love lists of next steps. It's the way that I get stuff done. If I didn't have them, I wouldn't get stuff done. And sure, there's plenty of, processing that you might need to do to figure out, a comprehensive list of next steps, but could also be as simple as convening a meeting with your peers, or potentially sitting with what does truth and storytelling mean to you for your relationship with your peers, with the land that you own or that you tend. Yeah, they're valuable things.
Sarah?
I do have a question, but I would cede my question if a sister had a question. So speak up or I will. I guess my question is, in relationship to, well, I have two questions. One, in terms of communities or people who are seeking to do a land justice transition and making their assessment of like, what are the limitations or the like the strings that could be attached to this, and how do we come into honesty about that with it amongst ourselves. I'm just curious if there's other things that are kind of like really feeling like they're big chunks to figure out. I saw that liability was named in a couple of ways. And so I'm curious if there's specific kinds of liability that feel like limitations on doing a transition. And I just kind of invite sisters to think about that, maybe get in touch with us if there are particular things that are feeling like, oh, this might be a string attached and we're concerned about it. And then the other thing I'm thinking about is, the strand that speaks about being honest about one's needs as a title holder. I'm curious what, and I know that this is a rubric that's focused on, what can we put on the table? What's a genuine offer, which means, having our own answers. But I wonder if there's actually, and sorry, I didn't have this feedback earlier. I wonder if there's another strand, or maybe it's part of the land back and reparations strand that's about coming into contact with each other internally about like, how much are we going to be in solidarity with the needs that potential new stewards have? If they need more time, if they need a like how open are we to listening and responding to those needs? Or are we kind of like, this is what we got, and I hope that it works for you? Like kind of having an internal assessment of flexibility and desire to be in solidarity before putting out that offer. With, any answer being a good one if it's honest.
I love that you brought that up, because I have tension inside of that dynamic of like, oh, we have to figure it all out so that we don't kind of push, like go back and forth. Like, so I understand that, with some of the feedback that we've gotten and studies that we've done, that making a clear offer comes across as being really important, especially to a lot of the Indigenous folks that we've worked with. They're like, don't say you're clear on something and then not actually be clear. So like, I think that piece around getting clear is important, but I love what you're saying about the fact that the inquiry that one might go through that would lead to some other, maybe even deeper offers because of your willingness to be in solidarity is something to really internalize as a process and as a value set for your team. I think that's just how we can work in that strand into the rubric would be fantastic.
Definitely makes me think of the incredible book Emergent Process, which if you have not yet gone and enjoyed that amazing book, it is all about how we can meet a process right where it's at. It is such an incredible book. My goodness, I always mix up the author's name with other authors. What's her name?
Is
Are you
it
talking about
Adrienne
Urban
Marie
Strategy?
Brown?
The Adrienne Marie Brown?
Adrienne Marie Brown, thank you.
Okay.
It is Adrienne Marie Brown.
Yeah, and I'm super curious about some of the liability concerns, because my mind goes into a few different places on that, and so that could definitely be something we could workshop. Yeah. Looks like people are needing to go.
I see two hands up, Linda and Brett.
my question is just more an observation. I'm working on trying to apply some of these concepts to the individual residences in a city or, you know, a neighborhood, and trying to make application, whereas most of the examples are for large pieces of property. So that might be something for another conversation as well, or if anyone has any quick thoughts on that. But it's just, those are the kinds of land transfers that our particular community now would be working with in the future. So.
More urban housing
Yes,
situation.
yes, and I can make some applications, but don't know if anything specific comes to mind with any of the presenters, or if that could be something to be considered in a future presentation.
Thank you. I think that that is where Community Land Trust could be a very good partner in land transition. I would love to go into that with you.
And then Anne has her hand raised.
I was just wondering, like, if a community truly can't afford to like make a substantial, you know, discount on the land in order to be able to take care of the needs that they have, should they not get involved in this, or is that okay? I think partially because on the rubric, these are scaled and 4 is really good and 1's not so good. You know, can you talk about that?
Yeah, thanks, Anne. I really think that piece around time and building relationships. I've seen people say, we do need this amount, but we're willing to give you time. And even to work together to fundraise. Like we want this to get into your hands, so we'll give you plenty of time, and we're going to be on the fundraising team and work together on that. So I think that there's a way to really do this work, to find great partners, to stand in solidarity, and to meet financial security needs of the organization. So yeah, I think that's really important to hold, and to not have yourself as wrong because you scored low on the rubric of that, you know, that strand. To just be like, okay, that's just part of what we're bringing, so we can compensate in other ways, and that can be really, really filled with healing and solidarity.
Thanks.
I just jump in and just underline that there is philanthropic money that would support land transitions like this. There are the donor bases of religious communities. There are the donor bases of the partner. There's us and our national network. If money is the only thing, like, we can figure it out. The agrarian commons, many of you have watched the case study even last week. Over half of the agrarian commons have land that they bought for market price, but they fundraised together to do that. So just like want to underline that.
Wow, we only have 2 minutes left. Oh, I'm so bad at endings and goodbyes because I don't like when they happen. I'm always the last one to leave a room, like literally I'm the last one. So just want to see if there isn't a final question. Yeah, I think that maybe a final thing I'll say is just that I hope that everything presented today helps everyone deepen into their own conversations of what your dream of the future is for the land that you currently hold, and ask you to imagine what is the future you are imagining that embodies repair, and really trying to encourage everyone to go through the process with your peers, with your collectives, to arrive in that space, knowing what you need, knowing what offering you're ready to make. And with that said, there's a lot of conversations to have. We really want to encourage everyone to look, take some time to look through the materials that were sent out that we created for this training. So I think that they can offer some extra support. And with that said, I want to say thank you to everyone.